Hi everyone, Brennan Cantner here with Nexus Youth and Family Services. This month's wellness workshop is on overcoming community trauma. We have had some tragedies in our community recently, and I felt it necessary and appropriate to talk a little bit about coming together as a community, talking about what is normal and what is reasonable to be experiencing right now, and some strategies and resources and coping skills. So we're going to get started. So we are going to start out by just kind of defining community violence and community trauma. So we are in a unique situation just in our community. It's very small, and so when something happens, it's very impactful and the ripple effect is big. So community violence is exposure, the community's exposure as a whole, as groups, to violence or trauma that's in public areas, that's committed by individuals not related to the victim. Community violence is sudden and it happens without warning. And it's kind of a blanket phrase that can include a variety of things, with gun violence, unfortunately, being the most prevalent, not necessarily in our community, but when you hear it spoken about. So trauma itself is very real, and it can impact people in a lot of different ways, and there's different types of trauma and there's different responses to trauma. So trauma is a deeply distressing or disturbing experience that you can experience directly or indirectly. So there's something called secondary trauma. So if you are like, for example, first responders, the trauma itself is like going into a fire, like a firefighter going into a fire to save a victim. That victim is the person experiencing trauma, and the other person is experiencing secondhand trauma, the first responder. You see that in law enforcement. You can see it across the board, but when you think about it, with law enforcement responding to situations that they're responding to trauma, but then themselves are impacted by it in a different kind of way. So that's something that is happening in our community, like when there was, with suicide, for example, the person that, the family is directly experiencing trauma, but that secondary impact of the people around them is huge. So there's lots of different types of trauma. Here's some to name a few. So being bullied, being abused, losing a loved one, living through some like natural disaster, like a fire, being exposed to something bad that happened to a loved one. So that's that secondary trauma that I was talking about, seeing something violent. So if you take a minute here and think about what are some examples of trauma that you, a friend, a loved one, or the community have recently experienced, and just kind of take a minute and sit with that. So as I was saying, we all react to trauma in different ways. So experiencing a wide range of physical and emotional reactions is super normal. And there is no right or wrong way to think or feel or respond when you are dealing with trauma. So it's important to not judge your own reactions or to those reactions of other people. I really like this saying, your responses are normal reactions to abnormal events. Community trauma is not something that we experience every day, but it is something that we experience. There's been big events in the world, in our community, over the past several years. So when you are thinking about trauma, sometimes people kind of push away their own feelings, saying, well, like, they had it worse than me. That's not, like, that someone else might be experiencing something bigger than you. It might be impacting them different, but it doesn't take away from what you're feeling. Same, if somebody else isn't responding as strongly as you are, That doesn't matter. Like, your feelings are your own and you have a right to them. So some normal expected reactions, this list is not comprehensive by any means, but some normal reaction examples: guilt, anger, sadness, struggling to concentrate, preoccupation with thinking about the traumatic event, sleep issues, changes in appetite, hypervigilance, noticing some physical symptoms like your heart beating fast, things like that. All of those are super normal when experiencing trauma. So the relationship between community violence and trauma, it's a direct correlation, right? So researchers describe the pervasive fear of violence, and that being what contributes to someone experiencing ongoing trauma, because they're feeling like they are at risk. They've been personally involved in the situation. And research shows that children that are exposed to violence on a regular basis are at risk for all kinds of things, mental health, development, all kinds of things. And so when we're talking about violence and trauma, we've had a lot going on in our world in the past few years, whether it's COVID, whether it's mass shootings, whether it's right here in our small town, losing friends and loved ones. But stress is hard on our body. It impacts our brain. It impacts our ability to think clearly. It impacts our executive functioning. So when we are at work or at school, so making plans, following through, focusing, making decisions, all of those things, like, trauma impacts those things. And so it's important to be mindful of the connection between community violence and trauma. So as I was just mentioning, there can be consequences for experiencing this violence in the community and working through our traumas. And trauma impacts people wholly. So to your very core, right? So mental health, your behavior, developmental, physical health. So as I was saying before, got ahead of myself, but impaired decision making, poor attention span, controlling impulsive behaviors, like I was mentioning, your physical health, increased risk for obesity, decreasing physical activity because you are feeling not motivated, mental health wise, PTSD, anger, anxiety, sleep disturbance with suicidal ideation, hopelessness. All of these things are very real. So again, I go back to that saying, your reactions are normal reactions to abnormal events. We can also see behavior issues increase. So, delinquency, conduct problems, like increase in substance use, things like that. So here's where we have really rallied as a community. Again, something that's unique about our small town, that we all know each other. So what can you do if you or someone you know is experiencing those trauma symptoms? First and foremost is taking care of yourself. It's important to, being selfish isn't selfish when it comes to taking care of your mental health and your own well-being. It's kind of like the airplane analogy, like put on your own air mask first. If you aren't taking care of you, it's really hard to take care of other people around you. So it's important not to hesitate in asking for help. It's important to practice self-care. And again, when I'm talking about self-care and talking about trauma, because trauma impacts us in such a whole body kind of way, it's important to do self-care in those same ways. we look at our whole body. So I love this mental health self-care wheel because it touches on all of those things: physical, psychological, emotional, spiritual, personal, and professional. So an example of physical is eating healthy, getting regular sleep, and exercising. Psychological, taking time for meditation, journaling. Emotional, exploring a hobby, cuddling with your pet. They're the best. They know when you're struggling. Spiritual, practicing forgiveness, spending time in nature. And it doesn't have to be big. It can be going to a park. It could be going into your yard. It can be going for a walk and sitting and just being in nature, right? It's just about connecting with yourself at a spiritual level and just sitting with yourself. Personal, setting goals, learning a new skill, reading a book, spending time with friends and family. And then professional, taking your lunch break. I think sometimes when we're stressed out, professionally or personally, we really lean into work, and we tend to skip lunches and skip breaks and not take vacations. And not set boundaries. So some good professional self-care, setting boundaries and taking lunch breaks. So resources, here are a bunch of them, but there's a national crisis line, there's an Amador County local crisis line, and then a couple websites here as well that you can look for asking for help. We have lots of services locally at Nexus. There is a lot of support within our community. So I love this little picture here. Life is tough, but so are you. So keep in mind, again, we have experienced a large community trauma, a few of them recently, and it's important to take care of yourself, ask for help, and know that what you're going through is normal. So I wish you the best and take care, and I will see you next time.